Have you ever listened to like your voicemail? If you were to call your own cell phone, have you ever heard what your voicemail
Oh,
sounds like?
like my own voicemail.
Yeah.
Not probably in over a decade. Why?
Okay. Well, every time I call you, I mean to tell you this, and I always forget. But your voicemail at the beginning of it, it has this little bloop. Like it sounds like
Call
you're
call me.
underwater.
Call me.
All right, hold on. Let me find you.
It should be at
It's
the
the
top.
weirdest sound. All right, ready?
I'm just gonna reject your call.
Hi, you've reached Ed.
Did you hear that? Bloop. It's like
Yeah,
a
and
little. It's like, were you recording it near a fish tank?
but it also sounds like a. You could hear it rustling in my pocket, and my voice gets so high, and that happens all the time. Like, hey, you reached Ed.
Hi, you've reached Ed.
Ah, I got to work on that
You really need to re-record that.
for real.
33, 1, 0. Main event of the evening. Wednesday and half past
It's Tuesday, and you're listening to Murder Unscripted.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Murder Unscripted. I am your host, Ed Hydock, along with the other host, my female bestie. And I say that because I have a male bestie that I don't want to ignore. I don't want him to get lost in all
No,
this.
no, we want to ignore him. I'm your only bestie.
Okay. He's dead to
Sorry, Jay. You're done. You're out.
me. Well, we want to welcome everybody to block number 3. And this is a block that we are calling It Wasn't Me. And mainly because of that awesome Shaggy song from the early
It wasn't me.
2000s. Wasn't me. But also because we are going to be focusing on people who were wrongfully suspected of crimes. And when we say that, we're talking about people who were believed to have been involved in a violent crime, but were genuinely 100% innocent. And these people were suspected by law enforcement. They were suspected by their community. Some of them were even suspected by their own family. And we have a lot in store over the next 4 weeks. And in our normal fashion, Melissa is going to be kicking off the block with sharing a case where this happened, where someone was suspected for a very long time. And we'll talk about some of the ramifications and like his side, his POV of things. Next week is the case of Risa Trexler. And Risa was a young girl who was murdered violently in North Carolina back in the 80s. And we're going to be going through that case next week. It's a case that I had worked for Cold Case Files. And in week 3, we're going to be interviewing Risa's sister. Her name is Jody Laird, and she's one of my favorite people on earth. And you guys are going to love her.
I cannot wait to talk to Jody.
You're going to get along great with her. I think you guys are going to bond. I do.
Good. I'm so
Yeah.
looking forward to it.
And then, as we do every last episode of the block, where Melissa's going to kind of walk us through one more case, we'll wrap up our thoughts on this theme on people who are wrongfully suspected and maybe play a little palate cleanser, because I think I made Melissa look kind of silly last week with going 4 for 5.
And I want a formal protest against that question last week.
Maybe get better at answering questions. Maybe you're just a bad test taker.
Maybe get better at asking them. Maybe get better at life.
Look, all right. Well, I'm looking forward to this topic. And Melissa, let's get into the nitty gritty. So tell us about people who were wrongfully suspected of crimes they didn't commit.
I'm glad we took on this subject or, topic or theme for block 3. And like Ed just described, we're covering people who were wrongfully suspected by police officers. And of course, my mind immediately jumps to like the West Memphis 3 case, which is horrific and wild. But in this block specifically, we are strictly covering people who were suspected and possibly arrested. But like, we're not covering people who actually went to court for the crime, other than maybe as a witness. So no one was ever convicted or acquitted or even had a mistrial. Like, we never quite got that far.
Right. And that's important. Like, we want to make that crystal clear that this is we have a block planned later on people who are exonerated, like full on exonerated, people who spent years in prison for a crime they did not commit before being released. These cases will feature people who are simply labeled killers by their friends, their families, community, the police, with the goal being to show listeners what it truly means to be considered a suspect in a murder investigation. The shattered relationships it causes, it tarnishes your reputation permanently, in my opinion. So it's a lot of stuff that like that we're going to get into with these cases.
Right. And like you said, when we interviewed Jody, I mean, we're going to hear everything she went through. Like, not only did she suffer the horror and pain of losing her sister, but then like the continued horror and heartbreak of being publicly named the main suspect. And like, she was 13 when this happened. Like, my God, as if being a 13-year-old girl isn't already hell on earth, but to be, chastised by your peers and community and I just can't imagine. So I think we're both really looking forward to that interview.
Absolutely, yeah, and we'll tease a little more next week. But Jody will spill all the tea. So I mean, she won't hold back about the way she was treated, and the way she was just looked at by everybody around, and she had nothing to do with it, and it took great measures to prove her innocence. So it's gonna no lie, it's gonna make you guys angry. Like it's a heartbreaking story, but it's also gonna piss you off.
Well, on that note, I have
So
another
look
case
forward to that. Yeah.
to piss you off. So,
Yeah, great.
So the case that I'm going to talk about today, I know that there's a City Confidential episode about this crime. So I know, Ed, that you're familiar with it, but I'm guessing a lot of our listeners are not, because I had heard of it, but I really didn't know the details of it and the particulars. So the case is the Gallaudet College murders and the wrongfully suspected and wrongfully accused young man named Thomas Minch. So before we get into Thomas Minch, we got to start at the beginning. So our first case of the It Wasn't Me takes place. It wasn't me. In late September of 2000 in Washington, D.C., which is the home of our nation's capital in the United States. The White House is there, the Washington Monument, Lincoln Memorial. It's like the political hub of the United States. Washington, D.C. is actually also home to 20 colleges and universities, including some big ones like Howard University, Georgetown University, and Gallaudet University, which is actually for the education of the deaf and hearing impaired students. And at Gallaudet University is where our story takes place. So Gallaudet was actually the first school, at least in the U.S., for the advanced education of the deaf and hearing impaired, and to this day is still the only institution of higher learning where like all of their classes, programs, services, everything are specifically tailored for students who are deaf or hard of hearing. So in the fall of 2000, the university had about 2,000 students, and this is a really good school. I do want to stress that. Like, Time magazine actually refers to it as, quote, the deaf Harvard, Wharton, and Brookings rolled into one.
Gallaudet is this bubble. Basically, it's a bubble where everybody feels safe. It's where deaf people they're an incredibly tight-knit group of people. And this is absolutely, as you said, the deaf Harvard, Wharton, and Brookings all rolled into one. It's the best school around for deaf people that everything caters to them. So this story rocked them to the core. Yes. No doubt.
It definitely did. I mean, that's like an understatement. So transitioning back to the case, we have a couple major players that I want to talk about. And our first one is unfortunately also our first victim, and his name is Eric Plunkett. Now, Eric was born on September 8th, 1981 in Portland, Oregon, to Craig and Kathy Plunkett. I know he had a sister named Erin. I'm not sure if she was younger or older. Eric actually had congenital rubella syndrome, which was discovered when he was about 3 months old. And the most common issues with congenital rubella syndrome are low birth weight, cataracts or glaucoma.
Do you have congenital rubella?
Woof.
See a doctor quickly.
Wow. Let me try that again. Developmental delays, congenital heart disease, and hearing impairment, in addition to several other side effects. So in addition to that, Eric also had a mild form of cerebral palsy, which I believe mostly affected his legs. So Eric's parents did eventually divorce, and he and his sister Erin moved in with their mother and stepfather. His name was Chris. And I know Chris had a couple kids from a previous marriage. And I believe Eric's mom and Chris had a little girl shortly before Eric went to college, because in some of the episodes I watched about him, they were talking about how, like, he was always showing pictures of his baby sister to, like, everyone at college. And he was just so proud and excited to, like, show her off. So I thought that was cute. So Eric obviously had his challenges, but you know what? He thrived. Like, he didn't let anything stop him. And he seemed to really have had the best childhood and teenage years possible. He was very kind and outgoing, and he had a large group of friends who just adored him. And he was really, really smart. For high school, Eric attended the Minnesota State Academy for the Deaf, and he actually graduated like at the top of his class, which is super impressive.
Yeah, he had a bright future, very
He
bright
really
future ahead of
did.
him.
Honestly, all the young men in this case that we're going to talk about really had done so much, it feels like, and had such a bright future ahead of them.
It makes it extra
So,
sad because they all did. They were all heading on the right path until they weren't.
exactly. So our case starts on Thursday, September 28th, 2000 at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and we're in Cogswell Hall, which is a freshman dorm. And remember, it's only the end of September, so school just started a few weeks ago. Everything's still fun and new, and it's about 8:30 p.m. and 19-year-old freshman Joseph Mesa Jr. is starting to get concerned about his friend Eric Plunkett. They were supposed to have met at 8 o'clock for a study session, but Eric still hadn't shown up. And Joseph and Eric had met during freshman orientation, and they had actually met two other guys, Thomas Minch and Benjamin Varner. And three of the four of them lived in the same dorm wing, and all four of them just became super good friends very, very quickly.
They did, I think one of them, Joseph Mesa, was either tutoring Eric or Eric was tutoring Joseph Mesa. It was one or the other, but these guys were super close. They actually called their hallway in their dorm the Wild Wild West Wing. So these guys had a sense of humor too. It's super cute. Yeah.
So Joseph decides to wait a little bit longer for Eric to show up, and eventually he's like, all right, something is going on. This is really weird. So he goes to find the resident advisor, and his name was Thomas Cook. So Joseph tells Thomas Cook, I'm a little bit concerned about Eric, and there's a few reasons. First of all, he blew off our study session, which is not like him at all. Eric would not do that. Another thing is that Eric's door had been closed most of the day, and actually all day, and that was definitely not like Eric. Eric liked leaving his door open to, encourage people to stop by and hang out or stop by and introduce themselves, which I know in college, like, we always had our door open because that's really the best way to, like, meet people and make friends. Like, people would just stop by.
I would think if I were deaf, I would want my door closed so that no one could like sneak up on me. I don't know, like I would feel, I think, safer. But maybe when you're surrounded by people who are all the same as you, maybe it's just like us leaving our doors open. It's our little community.
I think it was just such a sense of safety, and everyone was, going through the same things, and I mean, it is the best way to meet people. People are just randomly walking past, they see the door open, they're going to stick their head in and say hi. So it's weird that Eric blew off the study session. It's weird that his door was closed, and there's something else. Joseph claims that he smelled a foul odor coming from Eric's room, which I'm just going to say it's the dorm room of a college kid away from home. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess it probably never smelled Febreze fresh.
For that's an understatement. So as the proud parent of a teenage boy who I know is listening, the smell, he would agree. The smell is something, it's indescribable. Socks, BO, Italian hoagie, kind of like this mix. There's nothing like it on earth. And then, I don't know. I just feel like I need to be heard that it's unrelated to this case, but I don't think it was that. I think they smelled something much worse.
The RA agrees that those reasons are concerning, and he agrees to go with Joseph to Eric's room to see what's going on. So because Gallaudet caters primarily to the hearing impaired, they had like a visual type doorbell system. So students knew when someone was at the door because like when you press the doorbell, the lights would blink, like they would flash on and off.
This one is one of the most interesting and unique cases that I'd ever worked, is because of stuff like that. Like I learned so much about the deaf community and how they function. And it's incredible the way that their day-to-day life is catered to. This university catered to that. It gave them every sense of peace, every sense of like, if there was signs of trouble, they had ways to respond. If they had these little kiosks and posts all around campus that they always flashed, and it was very visual. Everything was visual. But to get some insight into these people's lives was awesome. I mean, it's such a cool group of people, and I am so envious of the relationships that they form with each other.
Yeah. And I think it would be really cool to go tour this campus.
You can go tour it.
Yeah, I think that's something we should do. Road trip.
Gallaudet.
So Joseph and the RA Thomas, they go and, ring Eric's doorbell and nothing happens. So they attempt to open the door. It's locked. So luckily, as an RA, Thomas has access to like a master key. So he and Joseph open the door and the room is completely dark. So they turn on the light, and first they see, a normal freshman boy dorm room. There are posters, pictures of family, an extensive movie collection. And then they saw Eric, who was face down on the floor in a pool of his own blood. So according to sources, both young men, took off down the hall to call the police. And I think when I first read that, I was like, what do you mean you took off? Like, see what's going on. But I think from the state of Eric's body, it was clear that, there was nothing they could do, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So investigators arrive and they are able to confirm that, unfortunately, Eric was, in fact, dead. And he had been a victim of blunt force trauma. And according to court records, the medical examiner eventually ruled that he died from blunt force trauma and a broken neck. And the murder weapon, which was left at the scene, was a chair.
It was excuse me, it was the chair that he was sitting in.
Yeah.
There was like a little desk, and this was no accident. This was cold-blooded murder is what it was. And
yeah,
someone had an axe to grind. I mean, that immediately points to like a personal connection, someone with an axe to grind, someone with a problem with Eric, because again, we're in the sanctuary of Gallaudet, and these things don't happen here.
Right. Well, and the homicide detective who was on City Confidential, he said that this was a brutal attack. And I mean, Eric suffered from blunt force trauma to his face, head, and lower back. And the detective also said that law enforcement, just like you just said, immediately took in the scene and felt like this amount of violence was so personal because there was just so much overkill. And the law enforcement pretty much immediately believed that the murderer had to be a student or a faculty member of the university. So investigators begin their investigation by interviewing students and faculty at Gallaudet, but they were definitely not prepared for interviewing deaf or hard of hearing people. So Detective Kyle Simiotti talks about how he was on the City Confidential episode. He talks about how even though they had translators, this was really difficult because investigators use certain techniques to feel out suspects. Like police will ask the same question several times, but they'll ask it in different ways, kind of to see if the interviewee will change their answer or change their way of speaking. They also use speech patterns and pauses and tone of voice, and none of this can be used with this particular group of people that they were interviewing. And Ed, you kind of already said this, but did you have any interaction with the major players in the case? Like, did you get to sit in on any interviews with anyone? Like, was it hard? I mean,
no, I was just involved in the writing side of it, but I can tell you, I can kind of relate it to an experience I had on set. I was working on a show called For My Woman, which was a spinoff of, ironically, Phil is still writing for My Man. I think it's still on TV1.
Really?
Doing well. So we worked on this spinoff that they had. It was a very short-lived 1 or 2 seasons. And we did a story about a deaf love triangle. I mean, it were the people we posted about it not that long ago. It was
Mm-hmm.
Daphne Wright and Darlene Vandergiesen. But the point of that is when we did the recreations, we actually hired a troupe of deaf actors from Gallaudet,
Oh
ironically.
wow.
Yeah, because we were filming Sirens Media, where I was working during that time, was down in Silver Spring, Maryland. So DC was not far. And to make it authentic, we actually brought in deaf actors. So when I was directing them on set, we were working with a translator, but a lot of times I would just kind of talk to them and show them. And we developed this chemistry without even using the translator, just by, I would act out what I need them to do, or I would kind of grab them by the shirt and place them, and they would kind of get, so we found this way to communicate. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I can imagine it's difficult because I know how difficult it was for me just to get simple points across. I wasn't
Mm-hmm.
investigating a murder. I was trying to get them to walk from point A to point B and open a door and walk out, So
Right.
I can imagine it was incredibly difficult because, like you said, you could ask the same question and they could respond three different ways just because the way they're interpreting your question through the translator.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. That makes me think of, like your tone of voice. Like, is the translator, is there a way to come across as aggravated versus calm versus, like all these things I was thinking about when I was watching this episode and researching this case.
and body language too. Like if you're being asked a question, it's by the time it gets to you, it's already through the translate. It's already secondhand. So like,
Yes.
does your body language change based on the way the interpreter is? I would assume that interpreter has to be a non-biased party too, just to make sure he's not leading them any. So it's got to be tricky.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm just thinking of now, and I'm like, oh, I wish I would have looked into that more.
It'd be neat. Yeah,
So,
we need to see.
So back to the case. So investigators do briefly interview Joseph Mesa Jr. and Thomas Cook because they were the first people on the scene. They found Eric's body, but it seems they weren't really able to add much more than that, and investigators moved on. So as the police begin speaking to people across the university, they begin to hear the same concern from many students, and that concern is that this was a hate crime against the LGBTQ plus community. Eric was openly gay and he was involved with the Lambda Society, which is a student led group to promote gay rights and end discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community. So apparently, there had already been a few issues on campus, including there was a time when an anti gay derogatory hate speech was graffitied on the wall, and I'm not gonna, it was foul. So I understand where they're coming from for sure. And to be honest, I mean, all the students were scared, and then to add this in there was just even more scary.
That was a serious angle because those incidents you mentioned did happen. So
Mm-hmm.
when they don't know what direction this is pointing, the question is, was Eric a target because of his sexuality?
That's in the back of investigators' minds. They have to think about this. They have to come at it from that angle. So they're interviewing students, and as they're going along, they're informed of a recent altercation that Eric had been involved in with another student. And that student was Thomas Minch. And remember, Thomas and Eric had met in orientation along with Joseph Mesa and another gentleman named Benjamin Varner. So who is Thomas Minch? Well, Thomas Minch, he was an 18-year-old freshman who came from a primarily deaf family. His parents and several of his cousins were deaf. So he was from Greenland, New Hampshire, and he had graduated from Portsmouth High School in May of 2000. And from my research, it seems like Thomas Minch was very popular and well-liked by his peers. He was super involved in drama and theater and was an honor student. And he was really active in the deaf community of New Hampshire. And this is wild. Like, even as a teenager, he went before the New Hampshire legislature and testified in support of a formal study to identify the needs and issues facing the deaf community, which, like, just the thought of doing that, like public speaking like that, and like such serious public speaking, like it makes me sweaty. Like, it's stressing me out.
So first of all, everything makes you sweaty. Like
Everything stresses me out. Yes.
the
That's
thought
so
of
true.
doing something, like you don't even have to public speak. The thought of public speaking makes you sweaty.
I mean, I'm sweaty for him. The thought of someone else public speaking is stressing me out. But
It used to be back in the I don't know if this is still true, but they asked people what their number one fear was, and death was number two. Public speaking was number one. Like, that's
yeah, I
nuts.
feel that.
I get it too. Yeah, it's awful.
So for Thomas to be able to do that, like as a teenager, I'm like, good for you, man.
Yeah.
So, much like Eric, Thomas had really dreamt about attending Gallaudet and was just so pumped when he was accepted. And according to the university provost, Thomas Minch had earned a presidential scholarship, which put him at like the top of his class. So again,
Wow.
just like Eric, he was incredibly bright and academically gifted. So a couple days later, it's now October 3rd, 2000. And remember, they had found Eric's body on September 28th. So it's October 3rd, and investigators, led by Detective Kyle Simiati, armed with the knowledge of like the altercation between Eric Plunkett and Thomas Minch, they go pick Thomas up from the dining hall and they take him to the Metropolitan Police Department's 5th District Station for an interview. Now, at the time of this interview, there were 2 American Sign Language translators in attendance. Now, in court records, Thomas stated that once he got to the station, he was just like immediately bombarded with questions, and the interview lasted 6 hours. So during his interview, Thomas did not ask for a lawyer, later stating on court record that he, quote, did not ask for a lawyer or call his parents because he was under the assumption that he was just being questioned and that he would be able to leave, end quote.
And also, you have to think about from Thomas's POV, he didn't do it. So what does he have to hide? Why would you need a lawyer? And that this is a great example of why you should lawyer up immediately.
Always.
Like always, because you can be as innocent as possible, but there are investigators and there are detectives who will square peg in a round hole. I mean, you maybe you've never been interrogated. Maybe you don't know how to act, and the things you're saying are getting twisted, and it just keeps going down the line. So lawyer up.
Always lawyer up. So also according to court records, Thomas testified that he felt very threatened by law enforcement, saying, quote, I remember that the detective said that if I didn't confess to anything, that I would be put in jail for life, that I'd be in jail for life, and that when I got out of jail, that people would think I was a murderer. At that point, I felt sort of threatened, end quote, which
I would have too.
Clearly, absolutely. So me too.
And
So
imagine
also-
being young, like that young, and facing those questions. Young, you're deaf, so you're in a position that you have never ever been in. I mean, you want to believe detectives, you know, you want to that they're giving you the right advice, but at the same time they're trying to label you a murderer. So I don't know, that's awful.
It's tough. It's not a situation that I would ever want to be in.
Right.
So also during this interview, the detective brought up the altercation between Eric and Thomas. So Detective Simiati asked Thomas about the fight, and Thomas acknowledged, like, yes, we did argue, and Thomas admitted that he shoved Eric. And Thomas went on to explain that Eric had tried to embrace him and expressed a romantic interest in Thomas, and that Thomas had reacted by shoving Eric. And according to Detective Simiati in the City Confidential episode, Thomas Minch made it very clear during the interrogation that he was not gay, and apparently he was very adamant about that. So, according to court records, Thomas Minch stated, quote, Detective Simiati said that if I didn't confess to the crime, that I would be put in jail for some length of time, and that when I got out, people would still think that I was gay, A, and that I was a murderer, B, and they would think all sorts of bad things about me, end quote. So this whole thing bums me out. Like, who cares who he's interested in? Like,
Just strictly to play devil's advocate. So you have this brutal murder on campus. It's very personal. And the only clues you really have are that somebody made threats against the Lambda Society, which that immediately is going to bring his sexuality into question. Like this has, and the level of violence, that the overkill, that has scorned lover written all over it. So while his sexuality did play a role in the investigation, I can definitely see that why it played a role. But at the same time, don't use that to bully. Never use someone. It's never acceptable to use that as a bullying technique. It makes no sense.
Exactly. All right. So this next part is is kind of confusing.
Awesome.
Yeah, great. So the detective says that Thomas Minch confessed, and Thomas says that he didn't. And the City Confidential episode interviews both Thomas and the detective, and there's definitely different stories. So whether someone is not telling the truth, if it was a miscommunication due to the sign language, I don't know. I will clear it up a little bit at the end, so stick a pin in that. So that same day that Thomas was interviewed, October 3rd, 2000, just 5 days after Eric was found, Thomas Minch was arrested, Mirandized, and charged with the second-degree murder of Eric Plunkett.
And just put yourself back try to put yourself in that place and time. So the very same day he's interviewed, I mean, the investigation is in its infancy. They just started investigating, and they've already pegged this guy as the murderer, and they're already finding a way to twist all the facts to make it fit that prerogative. How awful that this guy got railroaded like this.
So listen to this. I watched an episode of On the Case with Paula Zahn about this case, and in that episode, they talk about how after Thomas was arrested and as he's sitting in this jail cell, the investigators are, in the same building, somewhere probably upstairs, drinking champagne and toasting the quote unquote successful arrest of Eric Plunkett's murderer.
This is a great example of this. This reminds me of like politics, and God, I hate talking about politics, but if you turn on two different networks, one side's with the left, one side's with the right, the same story will have an entirely different spin. The same facts. It's like, someone just give me the facts. But that's like this with these shows too. Like some shows will latch on to, will use Thomas Minch as a great red herring, a great hook. Where others will fight to be like, why are they going after this guy? And if you only watch one of them, you get that impression that Thomas Minch is super guilty, when if you watch something else, it's all about his struggles and his journey of being labeled a suspect when he wasn't.
Absolutely. So back to the case, the next day, so he was, arrested, Mirandized, put into jail for the night. So the next day, which was supposed to be the day of his arraignment, the prosecutor let detectives know that this was going to be a no paper case, which is apparently prosecutor lingo for no charges are going to be filed.
Yep, no paper needed.
Right. So basically, the U.S. attorney didn't believe there was enough evidence to charge Thomas Minch, and his possible confession was just not strong enough. And the U.S. assistant attorney assigned to this case was James Jeb Boasberg. And on the City Confidential episode, he says, he's on it, and he says, quote, "The only real evidence against Minch was his own statements. In other words, that he had a type of relationship with Eric Plunkett and that he had struck him or pushed him," end quote. And he goes on to say that, they know that Eric was murdered by blunt force trauma, which is a lot more than just a push. Like
this was no push. This was
exactly
beating with a chair.
Right. And Jeb goes on to say, quote, "Minch's statements were a long way from that kind of crime," meaning murder. So the decision was made that they were not prepared to charge Minch.
I would think that so much could get lost in translation when you're interviewing a hearing impaired person, that they would have to come out and detail every little bit of a crime. If this was indeed a confession, they would have to lay it out. And then the body language would be evident. They would be acting like a regular person who could hear. They would be sad. They would just be spilling their guts about everything that happened. Where Thomas Minch didn't do that, and he's not even remotely saying he did it. Like, he's offering all these reasons he didn't do it. So aside from being kind of bullied into a confession, I don't know how on earth you could arrest this guy based on that. But sure enough, they did. Yeah,
they did. And I mean, I'm really glad that the attorney was like, no, guys, like, we don't have anything here.
But the damage is done, though. That's the thing. Like, I feel like do you agree? Like, when you hear, let's just take any celebrity who's accused of anything these days, whether they're guilty or not, those allegations are now tied to their name. So do you find yourself thinking that about, like, when you hear somebody's name who was featured in the news for some allegations, even if they were found innocent of them, do you tie them to that allegation?
It depends on who it is and what the allegation is, I think. But yes, generally, yeah. And I mean, that's what happens to Thomas Minch?
Imagine walking around campus where and they named him. He was named. So it's wild to me that would be publicized, and I don't know. It's got to be scary for the other students on campus to not know what to believe.
Absolutely. Because you don't know. I mean, the only people who know, one, unfortunately, is deceased, and the other's a murderer.
Right. And poor Thomas had to live with this. He didn't do it. He did not do it.
Well, we know that. But unfortunately, even though this, they decided not to charge him, the police did not drop their suspicions about Thomas Minch. And if anything, it seems like this made them double down. So listen to this statement by Terrence W. Gaynor, who at the time was the Metropolitan PD's executive assistant police chief. So this is the statement he gave to reporters after Thomas Minch was released from police custody. Quote, detectives on the case thought there was enough probable cause, but in the light of day, we agreed more can be done so we can get a successful conviction, end quote, end quote. So to me, that sounds like they are saying we need more evidence to get a successful conviction of Thomas Minch, not that they needed to get more evidence to get a successful conviction of Eric's killer. Am I wrong there?
I don't think so. I think Thomas Minch was in their crosshairs, and from a detective standpoint, I imagine that when the prosecutor dropped the charges, they were pissed. So now it was like, what else can we find? What can we dig up to nail this guy? When I feel like in those early stages, some blinders were put on because Thomas Minch was such a focus that, I don't know, other elements were missed, like basic stuff.
Well, and actually, I think I talk about this later, but Detective Simiotti, he asked to be taken off the case after that.
Yeah, so, I was surprised he participated, to be honest.
I was too. In the City Confidential, I was like, wow. I mean, we're gonna leave this for another episode, but
I got stuff to say, but I mean, it could go one of two ways. You could try to go on there and tell your side so that it's heard, so that people understand why you felt Thomas Minch was such a suspect, but at the same time, this was kind of a screw up, and it's like, do I want to show my face, and do I want to bring more attention to this part of the case? The case ends up resolving itself over time, but in this point in time, they had Thomas Minch pegged as the killer.
They did, and it's clear they weren't going to let go of him. So what does all this mean for Thomas Minch? Well, these suspicions had catastrophic ripple effects. I mean, especially across campus. Thomas, who, let's just recap, has no charges against him. No charges. He was suspended from Gallaudet University and forced to move back home to Greenland, New Hampshire. And he wasn't even allowed to return to campus, to get his stuff. His family had to go and pack up his dorm in the middle of the night.
It's like when you get fired and HR has to escort you out with a box.
Yeah, exactly. And the provost at the time, a woman named Jane Fernandez, she talks about how, it was a safety issue. We were afraid for his safety. And I'm going to be honest, I kind of feel like that was a cop-out. I feel like the university took the easy way out. And they're like, he's gone. Sweep it under the rug. Everybody's safe. It's all good. And
that's it.
And maybe I'm way off base, but I did not like where she was coming from.
Yeah, I don't think you are off base. I think it's the canned political response. That when something like this happens, it's about protecting your assets. It's always about assets. Like, we need to protect this university from bad PR. So yes, we're gonna paint it as making the students feel safe, but that also making the students feel safe also protects your bubble. It protects your image. And if students feel fears are alleviated, then maybe it won't be such a big public issue, but it's definitely such a corporate response.
So Thomas moves home and he takes a job in food delivery to earn some money while he figures out what to do with his once promising but now shattered young life. And he talks about, in the City Confidential episode, he talks about it. He was really down, and it was just such a low point in his life. And I feel like that's putting that lightly. They really did him dirty here.
They definitely did. And I think when you mentioned earlier about how the things he accomplished as a 15-year-old before, and how much he wanted to get into the university, and it's such a shame that his dreams were cut short through no fault of his own, just because of a little argument he may have had or may not have had. If he
Right.
pushed Eric one time. That's how many people I've pushed today. No, not many. I didn't push anybody
Push
today.
my buttons every day.
Every day, right? But I mean, it's a clear example of tunnel vision that police get, and it's a witch hunt, it's a miscarriage of justice, it's all these things rolled into one, and the person who paid for it was Thomas Minch.
Well, someone else paid for it, actually, because 4 months later, on February 3rd, 2001, 19-year-old Benjamin Varner, a close friend to Eric Plunkett, Thomas Minch, and Joseph Mesa Jr., Benjamin was murdered in his dorm room at Gallaudet University. So several people paid for that tunnel vision.
You are correct. And this to me is kind of where the vibe of the whole case changed, because now it wasn't an isolated incident. This was now two victims. And these students weren't just, they were still reeling from Eric Plunkett's murder. Now they're facing the reality that a madman was loose on campus.
This is your freshman year. You just moved in, and now by February, there's 2 murders?
I don't have any deaf friends, so I don't have any real ways to understand these things, but I imagine you feel extra vulnerable when, like, I couldn't imagine if I couldn't hear, I would be on edge constantly. And maybe you just adapt over time, but you came to Gallaudet for safety, and this is what happens.
So Benjamin Varner, our second victim, he was 19 years old, and he was from Texas. And as a child, he was described as a child with a kind and generous spirit, which, like, as a parent, wouldn't that be like the nicest thing for someone to say about your kid, that they have a kind and generous spirit? Like, that's so sweet.
It is sweet, yeah, but it's better than they lit up a room, I'll tell you that.
Exactly. So, Benjamin was very interested in different cultures and learning about different countries. Much like Eric, Ben was incredibly gifted academically, and he had dreams of graduating from Gallaudet with a degree in accounting. And actually, after graduation, he was planning to travel the world, and he was going to finally go see and experience and embrace all those cultures that he had spent so long, like, reading about in books and online, and just, he was actually going to get to go and do it.
Right.
But unfortunately, much like the dreams that Eric had and even that Thomas had, Ben's collegiate career ended in tragedy. So on the night of Saturday, February 3rd, 2001, the fire alarm was pulled at Cogswell Hall. And when this happens, all the resident advisors, the RAs, they have to go around to each room and, like, make sure the dorms are empty and that no one's, like, hiding in their closet or under the bed. Like, they got to make sure everybody's out. So when the RA went to check the room of Ben Varner, he discovered something just straight out of a horror movie. There was blood everywhere. Ben had been stabbed multiple times in the head, neck, and chest. And it was reported that his throat had been cut. Like, this was brutal. This was bloody. This was just horrific.
It was the second brutal, horrific crime on campus in such a short time. And this was interesting because this was happening. I'm not sure if you knew this at all, but this was happening after the students were on winter break. So the first murder happened early on in the semester. The second one, they had just gotten off winter break, and a lot of the students were downtown partying. There was a big party, kind of like a welcome back. Everyone's breathing new life. The Eric Plunkett's murder is becoming history. I know they haven't caught the guy, but we're starting to resume. We're healing. We're learning what new normal is, and they're all downtown partying. They probably get a little buzz, stumble back to campus, and there's those red and blue lights again. Holy shit, here we go again.
It's insane. I can't even imagine. This poor kid's had to be terrified. But guess who was in town the night of the murder? Thomas Minch. He had traveled from Greenland, New Hampshire to Washington, D.C. with his parents because he had a grand jury hearing on February 2nd, so one day before Ben Varner's murder. So, of course, police immediately zero in and they're like, oh my God, he was in town. So they go find him and they ask him why he was there, what he was doing. Did he have the receipts? Were there security footage? All this other stuff.
Isn't that nuts though? Like
It's so crazy.
What a coincidence! Like what I am hesitant to say Thomas Minch didn't do himself any favors, but he had to be in town.
He had to be there, exactly.
But what an awful coincidence for him.
I wonder if that has anything to do with the timing, but I don't think that it does, of the second murder.
Probably not. Yeah.
Right. So at this point, like I talked about a little while ago, Detective Smiotti had he had requested to be removed from the case, and there was a new team assigned. And a new team was assigned to investigate Ben Varner's murder, and this was led by Detective Pamela Reed of the Metropolitan Police Department. So along with a forensic unit, Detective Reed examines the crime scene, and leading away from Ben's room, there was like a blood trail, and then there were bloody sneaker prints. And these sneaker prints were very clear. And it was determined that these were like a specific model of Nike sneakers, size 11. So police come across even more potential evidence, or I guess lack of evidence, because Ben's wallet and checkbook were missing.
In Eric Plunkett's murder, you have a possible hate crime as the prominent motive, where now you have robbery as a motive. So you wonder, was that something the same killer did to throw police off, or because both crimes were extremely violent, so it has to be the work of the same guy, right? So why was nothing stolen from Eric's?
Was it?
I don't know. I actually know. I'm just building up.
Well,
mystery.
we'll talk about it. But the police look into the wallet and the checkbook missing, and they figure out that a check for $650 was cashed from Ben's account after his death. So police chase this lead, and they find surveillance video of when this $650 check was cashed, and they get to see who cashed the check, and they are shocked. It is Joseph Mesa Jr., the friend of Eric, Benjamin, and Thomas.
The trusted friend. These one of the guys who lived in the Wild Wild West wing.
Yep.
Awful.
So let's talk about Joseph Mesa Jr., because up until now, we don't really know that much about him. But you know who else didn't know much about him? The freaking police. Or they would have known that Joseph Mesa Jr. was not a new incoming freshman at Gallaudet. He was a returning freshman. And he was a returning freshman because he had already been enrolled at Gallaudet the year prior to when he met Eric and Benjamin and Thomas. He had been suspended from Gallaudet that year prior for theft. Theft. Let me repeat that. Theft. He had stolen money from other students. And I'm not talking about a couple bucks. There's a piece by Time magazine on this case, and it's called Murder in a Silent Place. According to that article, Mesa stole $3,000 from his former roommate. So he was suspended for 1 year, and they let him return.
It's like any basic background check on this guy, you would have seen that.
Well, here's another thing that didn't get discovered at the beginning. We just talked about this. Eric's wallet was never found in Eric Plunkett. His wallet was never found in his dorm room after his murder. And even more interesting, about a month or so after his murder, Eric's parents get his credit card statement in the mail, and they open it and they're shocked to see that there's charges made after his body was found. So his parents, of course, call Metropolitan PD immediately, and they make them aware. But by the time the police, figured this out, it was a dead end, because all of the surveillance video of the ATMs and everything else, it had been wiped clean, or it had been taped over, or, it had been deleted.
I still don't understand why. We're not talking about a case from the early 90s or the 80s. Why these idiot perpetrators always use They either cashed checks, they were doing it in Blackwood, cashing
I
checks,
know.
or using debit cards. It's like you're gonna get caught. Like,
I know. They're so stupid.
yeah.
But this case like makes me so angry because had police just bothered to look into Joseph Mesa Jr., who, let me remind you, was the person who found Eric's body. Like, I thought protocol dictated, or at least should dictate, that the first person at the scene is interviewed extensively. But as I told you at the beginning, police basically went up to Joseph and they were like, hey, did you see anything? No? Oh, all right. See you later. Not an exact quote, by the way, but how I'm assuming the conversation went.
Oh, you're kidding. That wasn't an exact quote?
Yeah, no, not an exact quote.
We were like, okay.
But they never even looked into Mesa. They didn't run a background check. And clearly they didn't ask for his academic or disciplinary records from the university, or they would have seen, oh, look, this guy was suspended for theft. And they didn't take a thorough inventory of Eric's crime scene and room, because they would have said, oh, wow, the wallet's missing. Like, this doesn't seem like rocket science. And let me say, I would never want to be an investigator. I have a lot of respect for what they do. Absolutely. But this to me seems like police work 101.
I agree with you, and I always side with detectives, and that's because of my working relationship with them. I mean, I've met so many incredible detectives who have been heroes to people. They're actual heroes. They solve crimes that no one else can solve. So I will always back the blue. But there are exceptions, and there are bad cops. Steve Peelan talked about it in our first interview that we did. 99% of cops are good cops. And every now and then, and we're not saying anybody is a bad cop in this, but there were definitely some corners were cut. And you want to give them the benefit of the doubt that, like, maybe it was because they were working in a whole new world. They were interviewing deaf people. And I imagine that a lot got lost in translation, but that shouldn't affect basic police work. And I do feel like some of that was missed in this case.
Yeah, and another student died for that.
And someone died because of it. Right?
It. Yeah.
Right. It's true. It's true.
So once police had this information about Joseph Mesa Jr. that they should have had 4 months prior, they decide to get a search warrant for Mesa's dorm room. And unsurprisingly, they find a pair of size 11 Nike Air Max cross trainer sneakers. And they just so happen to have blood on them. Now, following this, the DNA from Benjamin's crime scene did come back, and it was a match to Joseph Mesa Jr. So on February 14th, 2001, 20-year-old Joseph Mesa Jr. was charged with the murders of Eric Plunkett and Benjamin Varner. And we're already like running kind of long, so I'm not really going to go into the trial, but I will say at one point, Mesa tried to plead insanity and alleged that in his mind, he saw a pair of black glove hands signing at him to commit evil and kill Eric and Benjamin. And let me just say, all I think of is O.J. Simpson and the black gloves. So like, that's like, I'm like, O.J. Simpson was so like signing to you? Like
a glove? Like I'm just picturing a talking pair of gloves, like a hand puppet.
Or like the hamburger helper glove.
Kill your roommate.
Oh my goodness.
It's awful. It's not funny. It's not funny, but that's a ridiculous. He's grasping at straws, obviously.
Well, even worse, I read in a couple of sources that he actually like wrote a letter to his girlfriend at the time being like, it didn't really happen, but I'm going to go with it. Like, criminals will never learn.
No words.
So, much like us, the jury didn't buy the evil black hamburger helper glove. And after only 3 hours of deliberation, they declared that Mesa was guilty. And on Wednesday, July 10th, 2002, 22-year-old Joseph Mesa Jr. was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison and then 90 more years for like all of the crimes he committed. And there's quite a list. I mean, we're talking, in addition to the murders, we had like robberies, forgeries, carrying a dangerous weapon. There were burglaries, writing a bad check, like all these.
Right.
Yeah. So all of these just stacked up. This is an awful story. And what's really awful is that for 4 months, the MPD, Metropolitan Police Department, let a murderer walk around that college campus. they let like another bright, young, destined for excellence young man be murdered because of their tunnel vision. Like, I want to discuss this further in episode 4 of this block, but like, why did this happen? Why did they just want to close the case? Was this like an ego thing? It just seems like there were so many mistakes that were made.
There's pressure to solve these things, and some investigators get wrapped up in that because you want your department to look good, you want to put the public at ease, and the quicker you can make an arrest, the quicker you can do that. So I think that's what happened here, because it was Gallaudet, this deaf Harvard, solve it quick.
Yeah, at the expense of other people.
Benjamin Varner.
Exactly. So earlier we talked about whether or not Thomas really did confess, and I said I would kind of clear that up. So I'm going to let the fairy godmother of true crime herself, Catherine Ramslin,
she's the best,
tell you. Yes, she is. So she wrote a piece called Called to the Carpet, and it was about this case. And regarding Thomas's confession, she writes, quote, "He did not confess to murder, but records indicate that the interrogating detective told his superiors he had extracted a confession. No one asked for corroborating evidence, and a newly promoted commander had failed to question the detective closely as to whether he actually had a case against the boy." End quote.
Do you ever want to talk to Catherine?
Yes.
And get her. Yeah, I used to be her landscaper.
I love that.
We worked on a professional level, but I also used to garden for her.
That would be amazing. We'll have her
I got
on.
stung by a bee at her house. I'll tell you a story then.
Oh, your claim to fame.
I stung by a bee at Catherine's house.
I love it. I mean, I have a couple more things. So in the episode of the Paula Don show that I told you about, Thomas mentions on, and he talks about everything he lost and everything he felt during those long months of suspicion. And he said, quote, "I lost who I was. I had this person. I had my hopes. I had this dream, this goal, and I was going for that. I was on the path, and all this happened, and I lost who I was." End quote. And I think that sums it up very well. You had this plan, and like life never goes according to plan, but like generally it's not this thrown off.
This isn't like your car won't start. This is more of an inconvenience. This affected him for the rest of his life. I mean, yeah. I don't know. I haven't followed up on him. I'm sure it is. Yeah. Especially when he takes part in these other shows. There's his face again. There's his name coming out. So like, even if people in New Hampshire where he was living, maybe people who didn't know who he was then see this show, and now all of a sudden he's got that reputation again. So I don't know. It sucks.
It does. I mean, I will say from my research, it does look like he's doing well. He is a big figure in like the deaf community of New Hampshire and New England, and he is always pushing for just things to get better for that community. So I mean, he's doing really good work. And then I think just to kind of drive home like how bright these young men were and just how excited they were to go to this college. I mentioned that Eric had been excited to be accepted to Gallaudet, but he actually framed his acceptance letter and he told his parents, "It's just a placeholder, like until I get my diploma," which is just so sweet, like to be that excited. And apparently his mom talks about this. One of the last things he said to his mom was, "Don't worry, Mom, I'll be fine." And that's just so sad. You let your kids go to college, and I'm sure it's tough, but you think that they're going to be safe, especially like at a university like that. And he wasn't. And that's heartbreaking. And Benjamin Varner wasn't either. And that's just, the whole thing is terrible. And at least Benjamin's murder could have been avoided.
It's true. And Thomas was railroaded, no doubt. And I appreciate you. This block is going to be interesting. I find this really fascinating because I love the psychology part of all these cases. Like everyone knows the facts. You can read about them, you can hear about them, but to talk to the people and to really see the aftermath and the effects is what I find super interesting, and I hope you guys too, because that was an incredible example of what we're talking about. And next week, when I'm going to cover Risa's case, Risa Trexler out of North Carolina, 1984, I believe. No, it was the 80s. I think it was 84. That's going to really open your eyes to how police. We talk about tunnel vision. This is tunnel vision times 10. I mean, and the most ridiculous tunnel vision I've ever heard of. And
Oh,
we're gonna,
absolutely.
yeah, and you're gonna hear it firsthand from the person who took the brunt of it. The story is insane. Risa's story is insane, and y'all won't want to miss it. So join us next week.
And, you know, if you want to check in with us before next week, you can check us out on Facebook, Insta, TikTok, just at Murder Unscripted. You can check out our website, murderunscriptedpod.com, or you can even shoot us an email at murderunscriptedpod@gmail.com. But
We're giving out stickers. To tell them
we
about stickers.
are, yes. So if you review us on any platform you want, just take a screenshot of your review and then send it to us via like Facebook message or any Instagram message, any of those, or you can email us the screenshot. Make sure you give us your address and we will mail you some super fun Murder Unscripted stickers.
Absolutely. We're trying to grow. So the real story is we are trying to grow because we really believe in what we're doing. And we think and we hope that everyone else does too. So this is a way, and reviews are one of the best ways to do that. So we would really, really appreciate it even if you listen and you like us. Just it takes 2 seconds. We would really, really appreciate it.
Yes. So with that being said, we hope everyone stays safe. And remember, perverts don't wear signs that say they're perverts.
I saw one at Marshall's the other day. It said like "Live, Laugh, Pervert." I think it was.
Live, laugh, toaster bath.
Don't you have that shirt?
I do. I definitely do.
Doesn't surprise me. See ya.
Bye.